4 seconds is the time it takes to breathe in and out twice. It is the time it takes for a glass to slip from a hand and shatter against the kitchen tile. It is a meaningless interval in the grand narrative of a life, unless you are Elias Vance. For Elias, 4 seconds is the jagged boundary between a dream and a haunting. 3 years ago, at the edge of a track that smelled of scorched rubber and humid expectation, those 4 seconds had expanded into an abyss. He had watched the Olympic qualifying clock tick past the mark, the red digital numbers bleeding into his vision like open wounds. He had finished the race, his lungs screaming, his legs turning to leaden weights, but the world had already moved on. The crowd was cheering for someone else. The cameras had turned their lenses toward the victors. Elias had been left in the cooling air of the stadium, a ghost in a singlet, carrying the weight of 4 lost seconds that would eventually grow to define every waking hour of his existence. He did not cry then. He did not cry in the 3 years that followed. Instead, he became a machine of precision and quiet desperation. He woke at 4:30 in the morning, the air in his small apartment smelling of stale coffee and the clinical scent of muscle rub. He ran until his heart rate hit the red zone, then he ran further. He mapped his body as a series of data points: kilojoules burned, lactic acid thresholds, recovery windows. He never spoke of the race. He never spoke of the 4 seconds. But every time he closed his eyes, he heard the rhythmic thud of feet on the track and the agonizing silence that followed the buzzer. He was the national program's most consistent anomaly, a man with the physical metrics of a champion and the competitive execution of a man who was already mourning his own defeat. Julian Thorne watched the data streams on his monitor with the detached precision of a surgeon. As the lead sports psychologist for the national program, Julian was used to broken things. He was used to the arrogance of sprinters and the fragile egos of gymnasts. He lived in a world of high-performance luxury, a glass-walled office that overlooked the training facility, a place where he held the power to decide who was mentally fit for the podium and who was a liability. He was at the peak of his career, a man whose word could make or break a career with a single notation in a file. He prided himself on his discipline, his lack of sentimentality, and his ability to see the flaw in the machine. Elias Vance's file had been on his desk for 6 months before he finally requested a meeting. He had studied the biometric logs from every race Elias had run since the failure. The pattern was undeniable. Elias would run a perfect race until the 3/4 mark, and then, at the exact moment when victory became a tangible possibility, his heart rate would spike and his pace would stutter. It wasn't a lack of stamina. It was a psychological collapse triggered by the proximity of success. Julian noted it in his digital tablet: the athlete is afraid of the win, not the loss. He viewed Elias as a fascinating puzzle, a technical challenge to be solved before the next Olympic cycle. He didn't see the man who sat in the dark of his bedroom clutching a worn-out pair of racing flats. He saw a set of oscillating lines on a graph that needed to be smoothed out. Their first meeting took place at 10:15 on a Tuesday morning. The office was cold, smelling of cedarwood and the ozone of high-end air purifiers. Julian sat behind his mahogany desk, his scent a sharp, commanding blend of dark coffee and mountain air filling the room. Elias sat opposite him, looking smaller than his marathoner's frame suggested. He smelled of sun-faded grass and a faint, metallic trace of salt, a scent that Julian's primal brain recognized as an omega under immense, sustained pressure. Elias didn't look at the awards on the walls or the view of the track. He looked at his own hands. Julian didn't offer a handshake. He didn't offer comfort. He offered a question. He asked Elias what 4 seconds felt like from the inside. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. He said that it felt like the race he had planned and the race that had actually happened were 2 different events occurring in 2 different universes. He said it with a flatness that chilled Julian's blood. It was the voice of a man who had already accepted his own tragedy. Julian pushed, using the clinical tools of his trade, trying to find the crack in the armor. He told Elias that his data showed a consistent pattern of self-sabotage. Elias finally looked up then, his eyes 2 dark pools of exhaustion. He told Julian that he wasn't sabotaging anything, he was just waiting for the other shoe to drop. The meeting ended shortly after. Julian watched Elias walk away, noting the way the Omega's shoulders were pulled tight, as if he were bracing for an impact that never came. Julian felt a flicker of something, not empathy, but a predatory curiosity. He wanted to break that tension. He wanted to see what was underneath the machine. Over the next month, the sessions became a ritual of slow, agonizing progress. Julian realized quickly that the standard frameworks were useless. Elias didn't need a cheerleader, he needed a witness. They spent hours watching race footage in silence. Julian would pause the video at the 30-kilometer mark and ask Elias what he observed. Not what he felt. Elias didn't have words for feelings, but what he observed in his own stride, in the tilt of his head. Gradually, the Omega began to speak. He spoke about the way the air turned heavy in the final miles. He spoke about the sound of his own pulse becoming a countdown. Julian listened, his clinical detachment beginning to fray at the edges. He found himself noticing the way Elias's scent would shift when he spoke of the 4 seconds, the grass would turn sour, like it had been caught in a frost. He found himself staying late to reread Elias's training logs, not for the data, but for the margin notes Elias sometimes left. Small, handwritten fragments about the color of the sky at dawn or the way his shadow looked on the pavement. Julian was beginning to see the man, but he still believed he was the one in control. He still believed that his professional distance was his greatest strength. He was an alpha who commanded empires of the mind, and he believed that Elias was just another territory to be mapped and managed. The mistake happened on a Thursday in the middle of a heat wave. Julian was in a high-level meeting with the National Athletics Board, a room full of powerful alphas and influential donors. He was presenting his strategy for the upcoming Olympic cycle, his voice steady and commanding as he detailed the psychological optimization of the team. His phone, resting on the polished table, vibrated. He glanced at the screen. It was Elias. It was 2:30 in the afternoon, a time when Elias was usually in the middle of his second training run. Julian felt a flash of irritation. He had told Elias that their communication should be strictly scheduled. He silenced the call without a second thought. 2 minutes later, it vibrated again. Then a third time. Julian felt the eyes of the board members on him. He felt the need to project absolute authority, to show that he was not at the beck and call of a single athlete. He swiped the screen, not just silencing the call, but blocking the number for the duration of the meeting. He told himself it was a matter of discipline. He told himself that Elias was likely just having a minor anxiety spike before his afternoon track session. He finished his presentation, took the applause, and spent another hour networking, his scent of coffee and cedarwood radiating confidence. He was at his absolute peak, the architect of a winning program, a man who had silenced the noise to focus on the goal. When he finally stepped out of the boardroom at 5:45, the silence of the hallway felt heavy. He unblocked the number and checked his messages. There were 4 voicemails. He played the first one. Elias's voice was strained, the breath coming in ragged gasps. He said he was at the far end of the forest trail, 10 miles from the facility. He said something was wrong. He said he couldn't feel his legs. Julian felt a cold prickle at the back of his neck. He played the second message. The sound of wind rushing past the phone's microphone. Elias was whispering now. He said he had fallen. He said the scent of the pine trees was making him dizzy. The third message was shorter. Just the sound of Elias sobbing, a fractured, broken sound that Julian had never heard from him. The last message was barely audible. Elias said he was sorry. He said he had tried to hold on, but the 4 seconds were finally catching up to him. He mentioned something else, a word that Julian had to replay 3 times to understand. The word was baby. Julian's hand began to shake, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that made the phone rattle against his palm. He ran. He didn't call security, he didn't wait for a company car. He ran to his own vehicle, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The drive to the forest trail felt like it took a lifetime. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the road. He found Elias's car parked at the trailhead, empty and silent. He sprinted into the woods, his scent of ozone and storm clouds masking the natural smells of the forest. He called Elias's name until his throat was raw. He found him in a clearing where the light was failing. Elias was curled in a fetal position on the dirt, his racing singlet torn, his skin pale and clammy. The scent of sour lavender and metallic fear was so thick Julian could taste it. Elias was unconscious, his breathing shallow and uneven. Julian knelt beside him, his hands hovering over the Omega's body, afraid that touching him would cause him to shatter. He saw the blood on Elias's leg where he had tripped, but it was the stillness of the Omega's abdomen that terrified him. He remembered the word from the voicemail. Baby. He scooped Elias into his arms, the Omega's head falling limp against his shoulder. He felt the heat radiating off Elias's skin, a fever born of exhaustion and something deeper. As he carried him back to the car, Julian felt the weight of his own arrogance pressing down on him. He had blocked the call. He had silenced the one person who had reached out to him in a moment of absolute vulnerability. He had prioritized a presentation over a life. The ride to the hospital was a blur of red lights and frantic prayers. Julian sat in the waiting room for 6 hours, the scent of antiseptic and floor wax clogging his senses. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't call the board. He sat with his head in his hands, replaying the voicemails over and over in his head. Every sob from Elias felt like a physical blow to his chest. He realized then that he hadn't been fixing a machine. He had been breaking a man. The doctor came out at 3:15 in the morning. She looked tired, her scent of sterile honey and fatigue muted. She told Julian that Elias was stable, but he was severely dehydrated and suffering from physical exhaustion. Then she paused, her eyes searching Julian's face. She asked if he knew about the pregnancy. Julian couldn't find his voice. He just nodded, a lie that felt like a confession. She told him that the Omega was 10 weeks along. The stress of the training, combined with the heat and the fall, had put the pregnancy at extreme risk. Elias had been calling because he had started cramping on the trail. He had been terrified, alone in the dark, calling the one person he thought would answer. And Julian had blocked him. The doctor said they had managed to stabilize the situation for now, but Elias needed absolute rest. He needed to be kept away from the track. Julian walked into the recovery room and saw Elias lying beneath the white sheets, looking like a ghost. The Omega's eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. When he saw Julian, he didn't scream. He didn't even look angry. He just looked through him. He said, in a voice that sounded like it had been scraped across gravel, that he had heard the phone ring out. He had heard the moment it went to voicemail. Julian tried to apologize, but the words felt hollow and pathetic. He realized that the professional boundary he had fought so hard to maintain was now a wall that he could never climb over. He had won the board meeting, and he had lost the only thing that actually mattered. The weeks that followed were a descent into a quiet, frozen kind of grief. Julian didn't return to his office. He took a leave of absence, much to the confusion of the national program. He spent his days in Elias's apartment, a space he had never been invited into. He cleaned the floors. He stocked the fridge with things Elias couldn't yet eat. He sat in the living room, surrounded by Elias's things, the half-finished drawings of racetracks, the shelves of books on anatomy, the single pair of worn-out racing flats kept in a glass case like a relic. Elias was home, but he was a stranger. He moved through the rooms with a ghostly silence, his scent of lavender so faint it was almost gone. He didn't ask Julian to leave, but he didn't ask him to stay either. They lived in a state of atmospheric pressure, the weight of the blocked calls sitting between them like a physical object. Julian found himself tending to Elias's things with a devotion that bordered on the religious. He would wash Elias's clothes and spend an hour folding them, trying to find a trace of the Omega's original scent. He would replay the voicemails in the middle of the night, listening to the sob at the end of the third message until he memorized every inflection of Elias's pain. He was a man who had always commanded rooms, and now he was a man who couldn't even command his own forgiveness. It was during this time that the conspiracy began to reveal itself. Julian received a call from a contact within the national program, a junior analyst who had been looking into the coaching staff's private records. There had been a traitor in the inner circle, someone who had been feeding Elias's biometric data to a rival program for years. It wasn't just a psychological block, it was a systematic sabotage. Someone had been adjusting Elias's nutrition and recovery schedules, ensuring he was perpetually on the edge of burnout. The villain wasn't a faceless enemy, it was Coach Miller, the man who had been Elias's mentor since he was 19. Miller had been betting against Elias, using the Omega's fragility as a cover for his own financial gain. The realization hit Julian like a physical shock. He had spent months analyzing Elias's mental flaws while the real crime was happening right under his nose. He had been part of the system that was crushing the Omega. He felt a cold, final vow take root in his chest. He wouldn't just fix Elias, he would dismantle the man who had tried to destroy him. He didn't go to the police. He didn't go to the board. He went to Miller's private office at 11:30 on a rainy Tuesday night. He didn't use a weapon. He used the data. He sat across from Miller and laid out the evidence, the bank transfers, the altered logs, the recorded conversations. Julian's scent was a suffocating wall of ozone and lethal intent. He gave Miller a taste of what Elias had experienced, the feeling of being hunted in the dark, of having no one to call, of watching your life's work evaporate in the span of 4 seconds. By the time Julian left the office, Miller was a broken man, his career over, his reputation a pile of ash. But it didn't make Julian feel better. It didn't bring back the scent of sun-warmed grass to Elias's skin. He returned to the apartment and found Elias sitting on the balcony, watching the rain. Julian sat on the floor beside him, his back against the cold brick. He told Elias everything. He told him about Miller, about the sabotage, about the data. Elias didn't look surprised. He just looked tired. He said he had always felt like something was pulling him back, like he was running through water. Then he looked at Julian, his eyes searching the Alpha's face for the first time in weeks. He asked Julian why he had blocked the call. Julian didn't offer a technical explanation. He didn't talk about the board meeting or his professional discipline. He said he was a coward. He said he was so afraid of losing his grip on his own power that he had let go of the only hand that was reaching for him. He said he would spend the rest of his life trying to earn those 4 seconds back. Elias didn't forgive him then. He didn't offer comfort. But he did reach out and touch Julian's shoulder, a gesture so small and tentative it felt like a miracle. They sat in the rain for a long time, two people who had been broken by the same system, trying to figure out how to breathe in the wreckage. The resurrection began slowly. It wasn't a sudden burst of inspiration, but a methodical rebuilding of a life. Julian worked with the board to clear Elias's name and secure his spot in the upcoming Olympic qualifiers. He designed a new training program, one that wasn't based on data points and heart rate zones, but on trust and intuition. They moved to a small house near the coast, where the air smelled of sea salt and wild rosemary. Julian was present for every training session, not as a psychologist with a tablet, but as a partner with a stopwatch and a bottle of water. He watched Elias's body change as the pregnancy progressed. The Omega was fierce, his love for the life growing inside him giving him a strength that no training program could replicate. He ran in the early mornings, his stride long and fluid, his scent of orange blossom returning with a vengeance. They didn't talk about the Olympics. They talked about the way the light hit the water at 6 in the evening. They talked about names. They talked about the future as if it were something they actually had a right to. 1 month before the qualifier, they had their most difficult session. They were at a local track, the sun beating down on the red surface. Julian had set up a series of simulated races, situations where Elias was put in a winning position and had to hold it against a pacer. In the first 3 attempts, Elias faltered. He didn't collapse, but he slowed down, his eyes darting to the clock. Julian didn't say good try. He didn't offer a platitude. He stood at the finish line, his scent of cedarwood steady and grounding. He looked Elias in the eye and said one word, again. Elias shook his head, his chest heaving, his face slick with sweat. He said he couldn't do it. He said the 4 seconds were too heavy. Julian walked over to him, closing the distance until their scents mingled, the sharp coffee and the sweet orange blossom. He told Elias that the 4 seconds weren't a wall, they were a bridge. He told him that every time he felt that fear, he should listen for the sound of Julian's voice. He promised that he would never block the call again. He promised that he would be there at the end of every race, every day, for the rest of their lives. Elias looked at him for a long moment, the silence of the track stretching between them. Then he turned around and walked back to the starting line. He ran. He didn't just win the simulated race, he shattered his own personal best. When he crossed the line, he didn't stop. He ran straight into Julian's arms, his heart beating a frantic, joyous rhythm against the Alpha's chest. He wasn't a machine anymore. He was a man who had found his way home. Race day for the Olympic qualifier was a cold, bright morning in October. The stadium was packed, the air electric with the scent of thousands of people and the metallic tang of anticipation. Julian wasn't allowed on the track. He was in the timing area, his hands gripped tight around a radio. He watched Elias on the monitor, a small figure in a blue singlet, standing on the starting line. The Omega looked calm, his scent of lavender and sea salt radiating a quiet, unbreakable strength. The starter pistol fired, a sharp crack that echoed through the stadium. Elias didn't blast out of the pack. He ran with a steady, calculated rhythm, his eyes fixed on the back of the lead runner. Julian held his breath, his pulse thudding in his ears. He watched the splits. 10 kilometers. 20 kilometers. Elias was in the top 5, moving with a grace that made the commentators go silent. At the 30-kilometer mark, the moment where Elias usually faltered, Julian felt his heart stop. He saw Elias's stride stutter for a fraction of a second. He saw the Omega's head tilt, as if he were listening to something. Julian leaned into the radio, even though he knew Elias couldn't hear him. He whispered the word, again. On the screen, Elias seemed to straighten. His pace didn't just recover, it accelerated. He moved past the 4th runner, then the 3rd. By the time they entered the stadium for the final lap, he was in 2nd place, inches behind the leader. The final 400 meters were a blur of sound and color. The crowd was on its feet, a roar that shook the foundations of the building. Julian watched Elias's face on the giant screen. There was no fear there. There was only a fierce, blinding focus. Elias surged forward in the final 50 meters, his chest hitting the tape first. The clock stopped at 2 hours, 8 minutes, and 42 seconds. He had qualified. He had taken back his life. Julian didn't wait for the official results. He sprinted from the timing area, pushing past security and officials until he reached the recovery zone. Elias was sitting on the ground, his legs stretched out in front of him, his hands over his face. He wasn't crying. He was just breathing. When Julian reached him, he sat down on the track beside him. He didn't say anything for a long time. The world was screaming around them, but in their small circle of space, there was only the sound of 2 people breathing in unison. Finally, Elias lowered his hands. He looked at Julian, his eyes bright with a light that hadn't been there for 3 years. He said that he had heard him. He said that in the last kilometer, when the air turned to lead and the 4 seconds started to scream, he had heard Julian say again. Julian reached out and took Elias's hand, his fingers interlaced with the Omega's. He said good. It was the only word that could carry the weight of everything they had been through. It was a word that meant survival. It was a word that meant a beginning. 5 months later, the world had changed again. The Olympics were still weeks away, but the training camp had moved to a quieter location, a valley where the air was thin and the light was golden. Julian was sitting on the porch of their small cabin, a cup of lukewarm coffee in his hand. The scent of the valley, pine and cold water, was overlaid with the scent of their home, lavender, orange blossom, and the milky, sweet scent of a new life. Inside the cabin, he could hear the sound of Elias moving around, the soft thud of footsteps that were no longer obsessive, but purposeful. The pregnancy was in its final stages, the Omega's body a testament to a different kind of endurance. Julian looked at his phone, resting on the wooden table. It was 11 o'clock at night. The screen lit up. A call from Elias, who was only 20 feet away in the kitchen. Julian answered on the first ring. He didn't even wait for Elias to speak. He just said, "I'm here." Elias laughed, a sound that was musical and light, a sound that Julian had once thought he would never hear again. Elias said he just wanted to make sure the alpha was paying attention. He said the baby was kicking, and he didn't want Julian to miss it. Julian stood up, leaving his coffee behind, and walked into the house. He found Elias standing by the window, the moonlight catching the curve of his stomach. Julian placed his hand over the omegas, feeling the small, insistent movements of the life they had protected together. He thought about the 4 seconds. He thought about the blocked call. He thought about the man he had been, the alpha who thought power was found in silence and distance. He realized now that power was found in the answering. It was found in the willingness to be interrupted. It was found in the way he looked at Elias and saw not a machine to be fixed, but a soul to be cherished. The Olympics were coming, and the world would watch Elias run. But for Julian, the real race had already been won. He had learned to hear the music in the silence. He had learned that the most important calls are the ones you never expect. And as he pulled Elias close, the scent of sun-warmed grass and orange blossom filling his lungs, he knew that he would never let the clock run out again. The training logs from those final months were different from anything the national program had ever seen. They weren't just lists of miles and heart rates. They were a collaborative journal of a recovery. Julian had kept his own notes, written in the margins of Elias's schedules. He wrote about the way Elias's stride changed when he was happy. He wrote about the specific frequency of the Omega's laughter. He wrote about the night they sat on the floor and talked for 6 hours about nothing at all. He realized that the data he had once prized was nothing more than a shadow of the reality. The reality was the way Elias looked at him when he thought Julian wasn't watching. The reality was the way they navigated the kitchen together in the mornings, a dance of shared space and silent understanding. The trauma of the 4 seconds hadn't disappeared, it had been transformed. It was no longer a ghost that haunted them, it was a scar that reminded them of their own strength. Julian had dismantled the system that had tried to break Elias, but in the process, he had dismantled himself. He was no longer the alpha who commanded from a glass office. He was a man who knew the value of a single breath. He was a man who understood that the greatest achievement wasn't a gold medal, but the ability to look at the person you love and know that you didn't fail them when they needed you most. He still remembered the sound of the 4th voicemail, the sob that had broken his world. He kept it on his phone, not to torture himself, but to remind himself of the cost of arrogance. He never played it, but he knew it was there. It was the foundation of his new life, a reminder that every second is a choice. And he would choose Elias, every second, for the rest of his time. As the sun began to rise over the valley on the morning of their departure for the games, Julian stood by the car, watching Elias lock the door of the cabin. The Omega looked radiant, his scent a vibrant, healthy bloom that seemed to color the very air. He walked toward Julian, his movements slow but confident. He stopped in front of the Alpha and reached out, straightening Julian's collar. He said that he wasn't afraid of the race. He said that whatever happened on the track, he had already won. Julian leaned down and kissed his forehead, the scent of cedarwood and orange blossom swirling together in the morning mist. He said he knew. He said he had known since the moment Elias had walked back to the starting line and said again. They drove away from the valley, leaving the silence of the mountains behind for the noise of the world. But the noise didn't bother them anymore. They had their own rhythm now, a pace that didn't depend on a clock or a buzzer. They were two people who had found each other in the wreckage of a mistake, and they were moving forward, one step at a time, into a future that was no longer defined by what they had lost, but by what they had found the courage to keep. The 4 seconds were gone, replaced by a lifetime of answering the call. And as the stadium lights appeared on the horizon, Julian reached over and took Elias's hand, holding it tight as they drove toward the finish line that was actually a beginning. The air in the car smelled like a storm that had finally passed, leaving everything clean and new in its wake. They were ready. They were whole. And they were finally, truly, running their own race. The stadium in Paris was a cathedral of light and sound. Elias stood in the tunnel, the cool air of the underground passage a stark contrast to the heat of the track waiting just a few meters away. He could feel the vibration of the crowd through the soles of his shoes, a low hum that resonated in his bones. He wasn't the favorite to win. The commentators spoke about his miraculous comeback and his troubled history, but they didn't expect him to challenge the world record holders. They saw a man who had been broken and put back together. They didn't see the steel that had been forged in the fire of those 3 years. Julian was in the stands, positioned at the 30-kilometer mark. It was the place where they had agreed he would be, the point where the race became a battle of the soul. They had discussed it for weeks. Julian had wanted to be at the finish line, but Elias had insisted. He said he didn't need Julian to see him win, he needed Julian to see him fight. As the athletes were called to the line, Elias closed his eyes. He didn't think about the 4 seconds. He thought about the scent of wild rosemary in the valley. He thought about the weight of Julian's hand on his stomach. He thought about the promise. The starter's pistol fired, and the world exploded into motion. Elias ran with a ferocity that stunned the field. He didn't wait for the pack, he set the pace, his legs moving with a mechanical perfection that was fueled by a very human heart. He reached the 30-kilometer mark and saw Julian. The Alpha wasn't shouting. He wasn't waving. He was just standing there, his eyes locked on Elias, his scent of cedarwood reaching out across the distance. Elias didn't slow down. He didn't stutter. He looked at Julian and smiled, a brief, brilliant flash of joy that was captured by cameras and beamed to millions of screens around the world. In that moment, the 4 seconds finally died. They evaporated into the heat of the afternoon, leaving nothing but the pure, unadulterated present. Elias finished the Olympic marathon in 4th place. He didn't get a medal. He didn't stand on the podium. But as he crossed the line, he didn't look like a man who had lost. He looked like a man who had been set free. He walked to the edge of the track, where Julian was waiting for him. The security guards tried to hold the Alpha back, but Julian pushed through them, his focus entirely on the Omega. He caught Elias as he collapsed from exhaustion, pulling him into a fierce, protective embrace. The scent of salt and orange blossom was overwhelming, a perfume of victory that had nothing to do with gold. Julian whispered into his ear, telling him how proud he was, telling him that he was the greatest runner he had ever known. Elias just held on, his breath coming in short, happy gasps. He said he had done it. He said he had run the whole way without looking back. They stayed like that for a long time, 2 people in the middle of a crowded stadium, perfectly alone. The world would remember the winners, but Julian would remember the way Elias had looked at the 30-kilometer mark. He would remember the way the silence had finally been filled with something other than regret. They left the stadium together, walking slowly through the tunnels, their hands interlaced. The future was waiting for them, a child, a home, a life that didn't require a stopwatch. And as they stepped out into the Parisian evening, the air smelling of rain and old stone, Julian's phone vibrated in his pocket. He didn't even look at it. He just turned it off and put it away. He didn't need to answer any more calls. The only voice he needed to hear was walking right beside him, and for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The 4 seconds were gone, and in their place, they had found forever. The race was over, and they had both won.